What's up everyone, and welcome back to more Reddit stories about entitled people, insane people, and all that kind of stuff. So as usual, be sure to subscribe for more Reddit content, and we're getting right into today's stories. Treat the fire drill as if it was real. My great uncle passed away at 97, and I heard this story at his memorial service today. He worked for over 50 years at the same confectionery factory, and for most of that time he was a boiler room attendant. This was just after World War II, and at the time most of the machines and processes were powered by steam, even the heating. The steam was generated by massive boilers, and it was his job to monitor the boilers to make sure nothing went wrong. These boilers could potentially explode, causing great damage. By law, the boiler had to be attended at all times, and there were shifts that watched them around the clock, even when the factory was closed. They took so long to heat up that it was easier and cheaper to leave them running at night. After about 10 years of no incidents, the company hired a leading hand who would also act as the safety officer. He had been a sergeant in the army, and he took his job quite seriously, being quite the disciplinarian. He instituted a multitude of new procedures, some warranted, some just to establish control. The first time he wanted to conduct a fire drill, he went around telling the staff that when they heard the alarm they had to exit the building in an orderly fashion. He got to the boiler room, and it was my great uncle on duty that day. He informed him he would not be able to evacuate with everyone else and had to stay with the boiler. The safety officer didn't give him time to explain why. He just bluntly informed him that he was to treat the fire drill as if it was a real fire, no exceptions. When the fire bell finally rang, my uncle did exactly what he was told to do. He turned off the gas to the boilers, vented all the built-up steam, purged the water, and joined everyone outside. At the evacuation point, they were doing a head count when the production manager spotted my uncle and immediately approached him and asked what he was doing away from the boiler. He said he was participating in the fire drill as instructed, but not to worry as he had shut the boiler down completely. The color immediately drained from the manager's face. He was asked how long it would take to bring the boilers back online. Apparently, it would take hours alone just to fill the boilers with water and heat them up. The big issue was that because they had done an emergency purge, they were required to inspect every pipe, joint, and connection for damage before to make sure it was safe to start to reheat. The other boiler men were called in, and they got paid double time to work through the night to get the boiler ready for the next day. Production staff all got sent home but still got paid for the day, as it wasn't their fault the factory couldn't run. It cost them a day's production as well. Safety officer did keep his job, but for the next 40 years the boiler staff were all exempt from fire drills. And this comment here says this: "This is why in the military, 'this is a drill' is loudly announced when drills are commencing, because there are steps you do not want to take in a drill that you still must take in a real emergency. In the military, in say a submarine, that might involve actually purging the atmosphere in rooms that must not catch fire with halon gas, while the crew in those compartments scurry to don their breathing masks. You don't actually do the halon purge when this is a drill." Sergeant Leading Hand was not very good at his job in the military. You don't get to be a sergeant without learning that when you're superior to a subject matter expert, but that subject matter expert is trying to tell you something, you do not override their expertise with your authority without a damn good reason. A bittersweet story of a crazy neighbor who gets arrested after years of torment. The story starts at the beginning of 2017. It had been a year since I graduated high school, and I moved up to my mom's place to try and find myself, but felt more at home with my dad. So I moved back with him, and we went through 2018 with smiles and future plans for ourselves. Sometime during the middle of 2018, we got a couple of new neighbors. Crazy neighbor, a man who was probably around his mid to late 40s, and his mother, who was in her late 60s. It slowly became clear that something wasn't right about crazy neighbor. He was always yelling at people and acting very standoffish to those walking to get the mail, and even being a creep to some of the other women who lived in the apartments. He would always smoke outside as well as in front of his door, and he knew and was told multiple times by the building managers and other neighbors that he couldn't smoke in that area. But he didn't care, and our apartment managers are the worst, but that's another story. I should point out as well that Dad and I are living on the 3rd floor of our building, while Crazy Neighbor and his mom are living on the bottom floor of the same building, and Crazy Neighbor's door is right in front of where my dad parks his truck. One morning when Dad is getting ready to leave for work, he gets in his truck, starts it, begins to warm it up, and makes sure his music is playing. Crazy neighbor started to attack my dad. He was trying to open the door and fight my dad, and even tried to close it because he saw my dad's foot was hanging out of the door. Crazy neighbor kept screaming and yelling at my dad to, quote, get off his property, even though neither he nor his mom owned the buildings. Dad was freaking out and yelling at crazy neighbor to leave him alone. My dad is a big man and he's smart too. He noticed that the neighbor was trying to pin him inside the truck, while crazy neighbor himself was between dad's truck and another person's car. So my dad started pushing back on the door and pushing back on the man. Crazy neighbor suddenly stopped trying to fight my dad and walked back to his smoking spot on the stairs. Dad soon talked to the building managers after getting home from work and learned of the other incident reports on crazy neighbor, the yelling at different people to get off his property, making threats to other neighbors, and making everyone feel unsafe. Most of the neighbors around us soon couldn't handle everything on top of crazy neighbor and moved to other places, including our other neighbors we'll call great neighbors. Almost a year after this incident, and around the time that COVID-19 was starting to grow into more of a threat, I went shopping for groceries and other supplies as lockdowns and quarantines were being put into place. I was driving Dad's truck, and soon I parked in the parking spot. Dad came downstairs to help me bring the grocery bags inside, and I was left behind to grab the rest. Crazy neighbor watched Dad go upstairs since he didn't want to mess with him, but he started to yell at me. He said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Just grabbing my groceries from the truck," I said. "You need to leave." "Huh? But I live here." "No you don't, get the f*** off my property." I am holding onto the grocery bags and trying to go up the stairs, but he keeps moving in front of me, making threats at me and calling me rude names. Dad heard the yelling and saw that his daughter was being yelled at by a guy making threats, and was not happy. In a louder voice than him at the top of the stairs, my dad says, "Hey, leave her alone." And the crazy neighbor says to me, "Get off my property, use the other stairs. These are my stairs." I'm starting to get scared because I'm not a confrontational person. But I didn't show that I was scared, I just gave him an annoyed look and then walked to the other staircase as a silver car pulled up, and out stepped this crazy guy's mom. She saw me walking away and going up the other stairs, and I could hear faintly but not clear enough her yelling at her son about what was repeatedly told to them. To be nice, not to smoke in the area, and that it wasn't their property. I make it upstairs and Dad quickly hugs me and asks if I'm okay. I told him I was shaken up but I was alright. Our next door neighbor, great neighbor, came up to us asking if I was okay as well, and told us how crazy neighbor had been making her and her son feel unsafe in the building, and that they were wanting to and going to move pretty soon. She told me and Dad that it might be a good idea to call the police, and we agreed. Since nothing too bad happened during my interaction with him, we called non-emergency and told them what happened. A cop soon came to the building and started talking with the mom of the crazy guy, and then talked a little to the crazy neighbor. The officer then walked upstairs and told Dad and me that he promised he would leave us alone, and that he needed to stop smoking in the area as he was told multiple times not to. About 3 days go by since then, and the situation got worse. He was then yelling at everyone he could in the middle of the parking lot. People in their cars, people walking their dogs, and even children who were just walking and playing around in the garden areas of the apartment. I was watching TV when I heard the yelling, and saw a great neighbor and her son watching his ranting. Great neighbor was on the phone with the police and quickly filled me in on what was happening, and sure enough, not 2 minutes later, officers show up. Crazy neighbor sees them coming up, and starts making threats to the officers. He soon saw he was outnumbered when another car and 2 more officers showed up, so he said he would leave, and he did. The mom soon walked over to the officers and explained to them that her son wasn't supposed to be at the apartment, and that he has had trouble with things before. Another officer came up to talk to myself and great neighbor, and we gave our statements of what he was saying and doing. The officers told us that if something similar happens again, to call them and get things sorted. And that phone call happened just 2 weeks later. After 2 weeks of not hearing his rants, not seeing him on the stairs, and not seeing his cigarette butts all over the ground, it happened. It was the middle of the night and Dad had just gone to bed. I decided to stay up and watch some TV, and before I could turn it on, I heard him yelling from outside the door. It sounded distant, like it was from another building, but it was close enough that I could tell it was on a lower floor of the building. So I opened the door to try and hear what was happening. I quickly heard crazy neighbor's familiar voice. He was angry at his upstairs neighbor, the good neighbor, because he thought the music playing from the good neighbor's video game was too loud, and he needed to stop stomping around. The good neighbor told him that he wasn't stomping the floor, but said that he would turn the volume down, and asked him if he would stop yelling. I guess he took that as a threat, because right after he was asked to be quiet, he punched and broke the window of the good neighbor's apartment, then punched him in the face, before running back downstairs to his apartment. I run back inside my apartment and quickly tell Dad what was happening, so we both head outside and hear the good neighbor calling the police and telling them what happened. I decide to head downstairs and ask if the good neighbor was okay. He said he was and told me about the window and getting punched over supposed stomping on the ground. I made sure he was okay before going back upstairs and waiting for about 10 minutes before 2 squad cars showed up, with 4 officers total. One went upstairs to talk to the good neighbor and another went to try and talk to the crazy neighbor, and the other 2 went to see reports on who they were going to talk to and who the person of interest was. The officer who went to try and talk with the crazy guy was soon met with threats and told once again to get off his property. It was an hour-long standoff since he refused to come outside. More officers came. I assumed they had reason to believe he could be armed and was a potential threat. Even his mom came in to try and tell her son to open the door, and that the officers only wanted to talk to him, but he wasn't having it. Half of the officers went around the building and went through his back door, and were met face to face with him. There was a loud bang, and suddenly each of the officers were shouting, "Get on the ground, put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest." The cops then dragged out the guy in handcuffs and leg restraints, because he thought he could still fight the officers. After another half an hour, the police left and the good neighbor went to bed, but the mom was still outside on the phone with her daughter, talking about what had happened. I went down and talked with the mom and asked if she was okay. She then told me about how he was always threatening her, and even hit her with one of his shoes, and that for months she had been sleeping in her van because she didn't feel safe inside her own apartment. It was because of his own mental condition and drugs he was taking. I also learned that he had been doing other dangerous things, like walking in the middle of the freeway during high traffic, and even tried breaking into her apartment because he forgot some things. I felt so bad for her, and offered her a place to stay if she needed to. She declined. She told me that even though that night was the last thing she wanted, she was happy that her son was being held in another place where she wouldn't have to feel unsafe. About another 2 weeks passed and the mom came up to my apartment and thanked me for what I did, for talking to her and asking if she was okay. She told me that her son would be in jail for a while, and not be allowed back near the building or he would be arrested for trespassing. I thanked her for coming up to see me, then she went on with her day. I got curious later that night and looked him up on my city prisoner registry, and I found out what his charges were. He was charged with assault in the 4th degree, burglary in a residential, malicious mischief in the 2nd degree, and resisting arrest. I hope he can get the mental health support he needs, as well as drug abuse help. Anyway guys, that's going to be all for today. Thank you for watching, I appreciate it. And if you enjoyed, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more Reddit stories. So take care, and I'll see you next time.